ご講演いただくのは、エドモド社のニコリーナさんです。よろしくお願いします。
こんにちは. Thank you all for being here today. It's an honor to welcome you to the first EdmodoCon Japan. EdmodoCon Japan に招待いただきありがとうございます。よろしくお願いします。I am Niccolina Clements Mangroo, and I lead the global programs and community team at Edmodo. What this means is that I have the opportunity to work with teachers from all around the world who inspire each other, Edmodo, and our partners on a daily basis with their collective knowledge and creative use of technology in the classroom. These teachers not only use Edmodo to set up their communications and collaborative activities in the classroom, they also use the global network that is Edmodo to transform their roles in the educators in the classroom. I'll talk about these teachers later, but the important thing to note about them are twofold. One, they've all had the opportunity to take on professional development opportunities to learn more about EdTech. And the other thing is that they've all had the time to prepare and make sense of their learnings so that they can thoughtfully integrate the new technology into their teaching practices. Now, prior to working with Edmodo, I worked in a variety of other roles in education. I spent several years working with PISA, the Program for International Student Assessment, and just before moving into the world of EdTech, I taught high school in a blended learning classroom. This required me to use online technologies alongside traditional methods of learning. And I'm enthusiastic to speak with all of you today because I believe that Japan truly has an opportunity, a great opportunity and a challenge to grow as a global leader in 21st century teaching and learning. And I have 3 reasons for thinking this. My first is, as PISA shows, Japan has already established itself as a global leader in education. Now, PISA, the Program for International Student Assessment, is a triennial assessment that compares the performance of 15-year-olds across 72 countries in science, mathematics, and reading literacy. Since PISA's beginning in 2000, Japanese students have consistently outperformed the majority of countries in this assessment. And in 2000, as you see here, Japan ranked number 2 overall. So under traditional constructs of science, mathematics, and reading literacy, Japan is already a leader. Now, beyond the rankings, Japan is fortunate enough to have been built on cultural norms that really respect teachers and view them as crucial roles in society. And this high status of teachers is not something to be taken lightly. Many other countries, including my own in America, struggle with this. And it takes a huge cultural shift to truly elevate the importance of teachers, years, perhaps even decades. Finally, in order to grow and evolve in a changing education landscape, everyone talks about reform. And reform, especially education reform, is complex and daunting. But fortunately, Japan understands reform and has already experienced some of the challenges, particularly with Yotori Kyoik. So in short, Japan's got all the tools, all the knowledge, experience, cultural tradition, and historical learnings to be able to grow as a leader in 21st century education and to demonstrate to the rest of the world how to thoughtfully and effectively use technology in the classroom in a way that can positively benefit student outcomes. Now, I'm framing this as an opportunity. However, it's a great challenge as well. And it's a great challenge not necessarily in the what, but the how. It's not about what PISA rankings are, but how they and other international assessments are interpreted and how they're used as motivators. And when it comes to technology, it's not necessarily about what EdTech tool is used, but more importantly, how it's used and how teachers are prepared to integrate that technology into the curriculum and into their teaching practices. This challenge of how applies to everyone, from policymakers to government officials, to content providers and publishers, to parents and society at large, and to educators and students. And it's up to everyone to come together to determine this path for Japan as it grows into this global leader in 21st century learning. So for the remainder of our time together, I want to break down this opportunity into 3 different themes. These themes draw upon my own experience, both working at PISA as well as teaching in the classroom, and now working with those tech-savvy educators at Edmodo. And these themes are the following: to be setting goals within context, to be connecting ideas with instructional models, and to be valuing educators. So when it comes to setting goals within context, this is where PISA rankings often play a heavy role. For example, countries like Germany, Brazil, Bahrain, they have all taken drastic measures to improve their education system as a result of what's called the PISA shock. That is a national outcry or crisis in response to surprisingly low PISA results. Now, in a country like Japan, where the PISA rankings are consistently high, the PISA shock may not take effect in the same way. However, you may still look to PISA to consider future education goals and how to shape them. So for example, one of the mandates of the next cycle of PISA in 2018 is to be integrating and assessing non-cognitive skills into its assessment. These skills look beyond PISA's traditional measures of student performance and focus on character skills such as perseverance, creativity, self-control, all skills needed to manage new technologies and operate in a global society. It's easy to identify these skills, but the challenge is understanding which skills are most appropriate for your local context, for your local community, your local educators, your local students. And PISA is an excellent guiding light, but there are other international assessments as well to provide valuable insights. So on this slide, I've highlighted another international assessment here, TALIS, the Teaching and Learning International Survey. TALIS is not quite as popular or widespread as PISA, but it still covers 34 countries, and it's just as rigorous as PISA. In fact, TALIS was introduced by Andreas Schleicher himself, Mr. PISA, as we call him, or as I call him at least when I worked for him, who intended for it to complement, so Andreas intended for TALIS to complement the findings of PISA. But rather than focusing on student performance as PISA does, TALIS focuses on teachers and school leaders in its survey. And I'll refer to these findings from TALIS quite a bit because I think it offers insights that you may not find necessarily in PISA, and you'll understand the complementary nature of it. So for example, TALIS hones in on active learning, which is a concept that I know is quite familiar in Japan, and it's extremely important for a country like Japan since it supports many of the non-cognitive 21st century skills that PISA will assess in the future. TALIS first defines the concept of active learning in 3 different pieces. Active learning either includes small activity groups in a classroom, a project lasting at least 1 week or more, or the use of technology in the classroom. And the good news, as you see here, is that according to TALIS, over 90% of teachers in Japan say that active learning is important to their teaching practices. On the other hand, this chart paints a different picture. This chart also comes from TALIS, and it's hard to see here, but I'll describe it a bit. This chart shows the percentage of teachers in each country who report one of the 3 active learning activities taking place in their classroom. And out of the 34 countries assessed in TALIS, Japan actually ranks the lowest. For example, less than 10% of teachers in Japan report that they use technology in the classroom. The average across these 34 countries, 37%. And when it comes to using small group activities in the class, Japan's teachers report this only a third of the time. The average across these countries is 50%. You can see other countries neighboring Japan, such as Australia or even Malaysia, that have even higher numbers than this. In Malaysia, nearly 60% of teachers report using small groups in their class, and in Australia, almost 70% of the teachers report using technology in the classroom. So these numbers highlight a couple of concerns. One is that Japanese students are missing out on an opportunity to be exposed to more 21st century skills through the use of active learning. The second there's an inherent disconnect between the idea of active learning and the actual implementation of it in the classroom. And this brings us to our second theme, which is about making a connection between an idea or an aspirational goal and the actual implementation of it in an instructional setting. The last numbers that we saw about active learning highlight that even if ideas are socialized, the actual methods of bringing them into the classroom may not be as well socialized. And the idea of active learning, it's a bit like an iceberg. It's easy to see what's above the water, but the majority of the iceberg, its foundation, its substance, those lie below the surface. And similarly, active learning as a term is just the tip of the iceberg, and that's what's been socialized with the Japanese teachers. But it's equally important to look beneath the surface and consider what the rest of that iceberg looks like, what it looks like and what active learning looks like to school leaders, to educators, to schools as a whole, communities, students, and even their parents. And I'm using the example of active learning because it's a modern day buzzword that we're all familiar with. However, this iceberg analogy can even be applied to Yotori Kyoik, the relaxed curriculum that Japan adopted and recently dismantled. I think most would agree that the idea of Yotori Kyoik, the idea of de-stressing students and bringing a sense of enjoyment into their learning, was a good one. However, this idea and even the policy to reduce school hours was just the tip of the iceberg. The foundation of this iceberg included major changes for school leaders, educators, students, and even their parents, all of whom had to grapple with the conflicting concepts of Yotori Kyoik on one hand and Japan's rigorous entrance exams on the other. Now, I don't know if Yotori Kyoik was the best reform for anyone, might have been. However, if a more thorough implementation plan had been put into place to consider the impact that Yotori Kyoik would have on instructional settings, on pressures of entrance exams and cram schools, on societal expectations, then perhaps it would have taken on a different form today. And again, that's if the foundation of the Yotori Kyoik iceberg had been considered underneath the surface. So I'll compare this iceberg analogy to one I actually experienced firsthand when I was teaching in the classroom. I taught at a charter school, and when I began, it was the first year that the charter had decided to deliver all of its courses, all of its lessons, via playlists. Now, playlists include a series of online lessons and assessments that students consume at their own pace. You can see here an example of a playlist on the left and a proposed flow chart for how students are meant to consume the playlist on the bottom right. Now again, the idea of playlists was an excellent one. Playlists were intended to deliver content and encourage self-paced, student-directed learning. It doesn't get much more 21st century than that. However, playlists were just the tip of the iceberg. The implementation of playlists was another story. Aside from the technical glitches here and there, the teacher, and that was me in this case, had been taken out of the equation almost entirely. And there was no instructional guide or framework to accompany the playlists. So I was left up to my own accord to understand and to determine how to engage my students while I was watching them look at all of the playlists on their computer screens. As a first-year teacher, I spent hours reviewing the playlists, understanding which ones were better suited to be watched at home versus in the classroom, and ultimately, I wrote my own curriculum to accompany these playlists and to ensure that I could still develop that connection with my students. While I felt impacted by these playlists, what I also observed was that my students were affected as well. And it wasn't only their relationship with their teacher that was affected, it was also their own motivation levels. Some students flew through the playlist in a matter of weeks and completed their online assessments, and then they jumped at the opportunity to take courses at local community colleges. Wow, that was a huge and powerful form of motivation. I would dare say that the vast majority of students, though, unfortunately struggled with this new method of delivery. And they sometimes fell behind by weeks, either by distraction or other means. and were severely impacted in the sense that they were less engaged, they were less motivated, they were falling behind. So this resulted ultimately in long hours after school to get them caught up on the material, either by rewatching the playlist or resorting to more traditional methods of teaching. And while I know other teachers were willing to put in the time and energy to ensure these students' success, we had no idea if our methods of teaching this material or supporting this material were on target to achieve the desired student outcomes. So the example that I've just shared is one in which the playlist was formulated at the school level, without regard to the impact necessarily that it would have on the teacher-student relationship or student motivation levels. But this applies to any policy or any idea that is introduced in education. And it can't just be the concepts that are socialized. It has to be the classroom practices as well. It might even mean that a policy can't get put into place until teachers are consulted and they're brought into the planning process for that implementation plan. This brings me to our final theme for how Japan can grow as a global leader in 21st century teaching and learning, in an era when technology and metrics of success are rapidly changing. It's all about valuing your educators. And it's all about, from the educator's perspective, it's all about being valued. Japan is at a very interesting inflection point right now. And this is where both the opportunity and the challenge lie. On one hand, as I mentioned before, Japan is grounded in a steep cultural tradition that respects teachers and gives them high regard. On the other hand, recent education policies have been inconsistent with this high regard for teachers, and they haven't necessarily considered how their policies will impact the teachers in the classroom and ultimately the pressure put on these teachers. I'm not saying this out of speculation based on my own experience, although I certainly do have a bias. I'm actually saying this based on the data. And here are just a few numbers from Thales that jump out at me. Reading here, 22% of teachers in Japan feel able to motivate students who show low interest in schoolwork. 22%. That's less than 1 in 4 teachers. And here, 15.6% of teachers in Japan report they are able to help students think critically. That's 1 in 7 teachers. And these are just a couple indicators of teacher self-efficacy, but it should be noted that out of the 12 measures of self-efficacy that were taken into consideration in Thales, Japan performed the lowest across all 34 countries. It's not just about self-efficacy, though, it's about status. What we also see is that 28% of teachers in Japan believe their profession is valued in society. This is self-reported. And 28% of teachers, that's less than 1 in 3 teachers. That's almost 1 in 4 teachers who believe that their profession as a teacher is valued in society. This is remarkably low considering Japan's cultural tradition and high regard for teachers. And these numbers certainly raise some red flags around the status of teaching in Japan today. In particular, if so few teachers feel able to motivate their students, how are they to address the gender gap in motivation in science that PISA highlights? This by no means is a small challenge to overcome, and it's an opportunity as well. So the question is, how do you show teachers that they're valued? And as teachers, how can you be supported and how can you support others so that you ultimately can empower your students in a global society and 21st century learning? I'm going to argue that the answer lies in a delicate balance between goals and expectations, professional development, and time. Today, the goals and expectations for educators and students are on the rise. And with the introduction of 21st century skills and new technologies, these expectations will not taper anytime soon. So if the goals and expectations expand, the best ways to show teachers that they're valued is through an investment in their professional development and allowance of time for them to prepare and actually re-envision their role as a teacher as they integrate new tools, new technologies, new instructional practices, and even new mindsets into their teaching profession. Some of the startling numbers I revealed to you earlier show that there's a bit of a misalignment right now. And it may have something to do with teachers and their schedules. We see that 9 out of 10 teachers report that their professional development activities actually conflict with their work schedules. So their schedules in part may be a piece of the equation. Another part might actually be school leaders. Even though 90% of Japanese teachers report positive benefits from feedback that they receive from school leaders, and even though the research shows that instructional leadership is positively associated with student outcomes, what we see here is that 1 in 3 school leaders in Japan are reported to take action to support cooperation and collaboration amongst their teachers to develop new teaching practices. I'm going to pause there. That's 33% of school leaders that take this action. For a reference point, nearly 80% of school leaders in both Singapore and Korea take this action. And the number is even higher in Malaysia at 97%. So as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about how to better support teachers exploring 21st century practices and new technologies, I'm begging and asking school leaders and key stakeholders in school administration or content delivery, support your teachers. Give them time and an opportunity to collaborate with each other and develop new teaching practices together. Acknowledge them and bring them into the equation. And to teachers, do not shy away from the opportunity to redefine your role and your responsibilities in the classroom alongside these new technologies. Now, you've seen these teachers before. These are the teachers in the Edmodo global community who have taken the opportunity to transform their roles as educators. They may be teaching alone in the classroom, but in Edmodo, they're a team, and they collaborate together on activities. They exchange ideas and lesson plans on a regular basis, and they inspire and mentor each other each day. I've learned a tremendous amount from these teachers, but the most important thing I've learned is that when teachers are brought together, either physically or virtually, and when they're given the proper support and validated for their work, or they have the opportunity to validate each other, they're unstoppable. And they're innovative in their ideas, they are patient problem solvers, and perhaps most important of all, they're wise enough to realize that many solutions and the best solutions out there take careful analysis and time. And I know that Japanese teachers are no exception to this rule and to what I've learned. I would dare say that Japanese teachers have already demonstrated over time that they are some of the most innovative, conscientious, and steadfast educators in the world. Just take Bansho as an example of this, one of the unique and timeless approaches to chalkboard teaching. Bansho didn't happen overnight. It was made possible by time and the support of teachers, and they were given an opportunity to perfect this. If Japanese teachers can accomplish what they have with Bansho and a chalkboard, imagine what they would be able to do with technology if given that time and given the support. All they need is an acknowledgement that they are a crucial part of not just what the future generation of Japan will learn, but how that future generation of Japan will learn. And ultimately, how Japan will develop as a global leader in 21st century teaching and learning. So on that note, I will leave you with a final message and test my skills of Japanese one more time. Isogaba mawere. In English, for those of you out there, it means if you hurry, then you must take the long way instead. So I love this proverb because I truly think it embodies the way in which technology, which is always in a hurry and will always be in a hurry, the way in which technology can and should be thoughtfully integrated into teaching and learning, into those practices over time to ensure long-term success. So as you listen to the other presentations today, I encourage you to pay attention to not just the what is being said, but how that has been done, and how teachers have successfully been able to integrate their technologies into their teaching practices. I thank you all for your attention today, and I invite you to please enjoy the rest of your afternoon with Edmodo Japan.
Thank you, Niccolina. それでは質疑応答に移りたいと思います。Could you please come here? Here are some questions from the audience. May I ask you some?
Yes, of course.
Here. Do you have any research materials about the country which participate TALIS and materials about what kind of questions TALIS asks?
Lots of research. I've actually referenced a few of the pieces that I quoted in my presentation, but I would be happy to share more with the team here at Zettokai so that can be passed on to the viewers.
Thank you. So next, would you give us some examples of active learning activities which we can introduce without much difficulty in Japanese classroom environment?
Absolutely. And I actually think you're going to have an opportunity to hear about this quite a bit today. I'm going to speak to some examples that I'm most familiar with, which is using Edmodo right now. That's a combination of using a technology. So that alone is actually an active learning practice in and of itself. But I really want to hone in on the use of small groups in the classroom. The use of small groups allows you to differentiate your learning, which again, differentiation is another buzzword that people are clear on, that people know today. With small groups, this is actually something that we use in Edmodo today, where you have a group and you can basically create that as your classroom. And it could be your classroom communication tool. And then you can identify, well, how can I break up my class into the different types of students that I work with? If I think back on my own teaching, I had some students that were ahead of the curve. And so they were really ready to learn more. Those were the students that wanted to take those community college courses within a matter of weeks. And then I had other students that were taking a little longer to digest the content. So the valuable part of small groups in an online setting is that you're able to, in advance, prepare some lesson plans to tailor it to, say, a group of students that they're ready to do more, so you give them more advanced questions or materials. And then simultaneously give another set of learning or another set of lesson plans to students that may take a little bit longer to digest that material. The use of small groups on Edmodo is something that not only had I been a teacher and been able to use Edmodo, I would have taken advantage of it, but I do see teachers using that today as well. Another example of this with small groups as well is actually encouraging students to be reviewing each other and supporting each other along the way. So one example, I'll refer to Edmodo, but you can actually use this even without technology, is giving the students a chance to peer review each other's work. So on Edmodo, we have examples where students are able to submit their papers or an early version of their papers using O365 or other tools, and then they're able to comment on each other's work. Now that's something in Edmodo that's very easy to do because you have a small group with just a few students. But in a more traditional setting, if you don't happen to have the technology, if you have a chance to rearrange the desks and to put students into those small groups with clear guidelines, you can tailor those activities to the group of students that you're working with.
Thank you.
Yes.
ありがとうございました。